So welcome. This is our monthly webinar series where we're digging into the 5th edition of Utilization-focused evaluation. And as always, we want to start with acknowledgement. This is our local land and context acknowledgement. We were thrilled to be back to the first in-person AEA in several years, which was held in New Orleans, which is Bulbancha in Choctaw. Which means the place of many tongues. So we learned a lot about the land and the people from that area. This meeting of land and water was a space of exchange for Indigenous people for many centuries. And so it was really great to be there. And there was a lot of talk at the conference about decolonizing evaluation, a keynote by Edward Villanueva of Decolonizing Well. So if you didn't have a chance to be there in person, we're going to reflect a little bit, but hopefully you can have a chance to check out some of the recorded materials. And while I was in New Orleans, I made a point to visit Congo Square, which is a historic gathering place for Indigenous people and as well as enslaved Africans, and is known as the birthplace of jazz. And we kicked off this webinar with some jazz as well. Now that we're back home, I want to acknowledge that we are on Dakota land in Anishinaabe territory known as Minnesota. And Michael and I are settlers on this land. And we take seriously our commitment to being allies to Indigenous people and righting some of the wrongs. One of the ways we're doing that is by redistributing the royalties. So these are two organizations, the Hota Iapi Okotai Chiai and the Indigenous Environmental Network, are recipients of the royalties this year. And it's snowing here in Minnesota, so I'm just showing you a little picture of that as well. We've already got some snow. And then we also just want to acknowledge globally the events of COP27 are taking place right now in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So a lot happening, and we're happy you're joining us today, and invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and share where you're joining us from as well, if you would like. We're going to just kick off with a little bit of a reflection on the AEA conference we just returned from, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael to let him begin.
Greetings, everyone. So there were 2,600 participants, more than expected, and a large proportion of those, I have a sense from show of hands, that over half were first-time participants in AEA. I did a pre-conference workshop on principles-focused developmental evaluation, and 2/3 of the people in that group were new to AEA, new evaluators. A few old-timers were a part of that, but it's really attracting a lot of new people, and easily I would say 1/3 of the conference were international people from all over the world. In the Birds of a Feather Blue Marble group in picture that you see in the upper left there are folks from Japan, Pakistan, Canada, Senegal, Brazil. And so it was really a lot of international interest, and the themes of collaboration and shared leadership were an important theme throughout the conference. The president, Veronica Olazamba, decided not to do an individual presidential address, but rather to emphasize bringing many voices and people to the attention of the conference through the plenaries and the presidential strand. And so those were major themes running throughout.
Yeah, I think that it was really a lot of just about reconnecting with one another. And for all those new evaluators, I do think that as we think forward for conferences, having more intentionality about how we guide newcomers through the conference would be great. As a friend of mine was there as a new evaluator, or not even really an evaluator, and figuring out how do we support newcomers to, have a pathway through that doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. And also just the desire for more sessions that were interactive. I think we still have sort of this old format of like stand and deliver, and especially nowadays after coming through COVID and doing so much online, I think the value add of being in person is actually more of those exchanges and being able to connect. And so as we think forward for conferences like this, how do we make more spaces like that and less of just delivering content? So
I have done a YouTube video reviewing AEA that will be out later today. So we'll make sure you know about that.
yeah, and if anyone else who's on was there and you want to pop any comments you had in the chat, welcome. And it's great to see where y'all are joining us from, and Ahmed from COP27. That's so great. So with that, we will get going with our monthly theme. And we missed last month. We usually do the monthly. We weren't able to do October. And so we're combining two themes. So just as a reminder, our overarching principle of utilization-focused evaluation is to focus on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect of and at every stage of an evaluation. These are the 10 operating principles of UFE, and today we're going to be talking about principles 7 and 8. So we've covered 1 through 6 in previous webinars, and if you weren't there or you weren't with us for those are all recorded. And when we follow up with this webinar, you'll get a link to where you can find all of them. So we're going to start with principle 7, which is to strategize process use. This is chapter 12 of the book. And that principle is to facilitate processes with intentionality. Be aware of and strategic about how being involved in the evaluation affects those involved. So at an individual level, participating in an evaluation can help develop and augment someone's evaluation knowledge and skills, as well as just, their sense of interest and different perspectives on the program and on the evaluation itself. At the organization level, evaluation processes can build more of an adaptive capacity and learning and evaluative thinking to be part of the organizational culture. And so these can really be enhanced through UFE facilitation. And being aware of these possibilities really helps us be more intentional about the impacts and evaluation beyond and separate from findings use, which tends to get the most attention, especially that opportunity for people who are involved to think and learn evaluatively. So the premises are that the processes undertaken in evaluation have impacts on those involved, and that process use occurs when those involved in the evaluation learn from the evaluation process itself or make program changes based on the evaluation process rather than just the findings. So just to reiterate, it's kind of a jargony term maybe. So process use, what is it? It's the cognitive, attitudinal, and behavior changes in individuals and program or organization changes resulting either directly or indirectly from engagement in the evaluation process and learning to think evaluatively. So that's what we're talking about. Do you want to give some examples, Michael?
Let me add that the identification of process use is really, I think, a game changer for how we think about evaluation. The first edition of utilization-focused evaluation came out in 1978 and the second edition in 86. And both of those, reflecting the field, reported research and studies on how to increase findings use, and the focus was all on findings. When I went to do the third edition and went back through notes following up evaluations I had done, I would see that as I interviewed people and asked them about how the evaluation was used, they would say, well, we used this finding and this recommendation was helpful. This other one wasn't so much. But what was really useful was going through the process. And I could see right there in the transcripts, I would say, well, I'm glad you like the process. Tell me more about the findings. We didn't have a place to put process use. We didn't have a way to think about it. It's a good example of paradigm blinders of the ways in which our categories affect what we can even hear or see. But seeing enough of those, this was right at the time that there was beginning to be talk about learning organizations. There was a lot more attention to evaluative thinking beginning to emerge. And so what came out in the third edition was, for the first time, that a major impact of evaluation was beyond the findings, but learning to think evaluatively, learning to understand evaluatively was a major way in which the evaluation had an impact. And what we had turned up was the effects unintentionally of process use. What's important about the principle, as currently stated, and as Charmaine read it to you, is we're talking about making process use intentional. It's always a side effect. People go through it, learn things, they make connections, they come to understandings. But intentional, strategized process use means it becomes part of the planning process, and that it affects how the process is done, who is involved, because those involved are going to experience more impact. So the selection of intended users takes on a different meaning when we know that not only are they going to help frame a particular evaluation, but their understanding of evaluation for the future, their commitment to it, their knowledge about it, will be deepened for the long term. And that changes everything about how we do it, including the cost benefit of taking time and engagement to work with people. It's not just about an individual evaluation, it's about making evaluation a way of doing business. And that's a game changer.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about how we didn't hear the word process use very much at AEA. And I think sometimes it's talked about as evaluative thinking or organizational learning, but
or capacity building. Yeah.
Or capacity building. But that it's still not sort of, and I don't know if this is a still or it's already become sort of so mainstreamed that people don't talk about it. I don't know if you have a perspective on that, or if you feel like people still aren't as intentional as they could be about it.
Well, the folks that do deeply collaborative work, people like David Fetterman, he's got a new book out on empowerment, evaluation, and social justice that just came out. And David was very aware of and cites process use. Brad Cousins, who did the collaborative evaluation book, edited a New Directions on process use. And so the people who are into it, Donna Podem doing feminist evaluation is very much into process use. Hannah's asking, how would you distinguish implementation evaluation from process evaluation? It's a really important point. First, let's be clear, we're not talking about process evaluation. Process evaluation is studying the program process. We're talking about how the evaluation process has an impact on people. So process evaluation is aimed at the ways in which people in a program are reacting to the process. Implementation evaluation tends to be whether the model is being appropriately implemented, that there's a way that a program is supposed to be implemented. Implementation looks at whether or not that's occurring, whether there's fidelity to the implementation plan. Process evaluation at the program level is generally more open-ended. What are the strengths and weaknesses? How are participants reacting? How satisfied are they? What would they like to change? But we're talking about process use of the evaluation, which is the impact on people going through the evaluation, the intended users, the collaborators, not about process use in the program.
Yeah, and we have some of these examples here on the slide. And this quote, the impact on our program came not just from the findings, but from going through the thinking process that the evaluation required. So this idea of setting evaluation priorities, clarifying the goals, and that's where things like conceptualizing logic models and theories of change came out through evaluation, often because that hadn't been done. And so it's even just getting people to rethink or think about how the program was intended to unfold can change the way the program is implemented, change the way that people are implementing it, or, participating in it or thinking about that. So these are some of the examples we're talking about. Go ahead.
Yeah, the performance measurement mantra, what gets measured gets done, is a good example of that. That when you pick measures for a program and what they're either going to be held accountable for or attempt to accomplish, it affects the behavior of people because they now know what they're targeting. What gets measured gets done. And if you measure the wrong things, you do the wrong things. So it's the impacts of evaluation come before you collect any data. And then in the ways in which we engage people in data analysis also continues the process of using evaluation quite apart from the findings.
So we've got 5 process use facilitation tasks that we identify in this chapter. And the first is to work with primary intended users to consider how deeply and extensively they will be involved in the evaluation process and who else would benefit from the process. So this is really helping to think about not only, how the evaluation will unfold, the design piece of like how to collect data and all of that, but really about that process of the evaluation, who will be involved in what the potential benefits could be to them. And as Michael said, sort of that cost benefit changes on both sides of the equation when the evaluation produces not only findings, but also serves immediate program needs like organizational, staff development, empowerment.
So
you want to add anything?
Well, Hannah asked for clarification about setting the priorities of the evaluation. And that's a part of what we do from the very beginning, is deciding with the intended users what are the priorities for the evaluation. An evaluation can't look at everything. There are many more questions than you can possibly look at and many different kinds of evaluation. So determining the priorities, one of the ways that involves process use, by which we mean people are learning about evaluation. They're learning to think evaluatively. If you take a group of intended users through the process of understanding the difference between formative, summative, developmental evaluation, accountability evaluation, learning focused evaluation, knowledge generating evaluation, they're beginning to understand differences, choices, different ways of using evaluation, which means their capacity is being built to consider those options in the future. And when you get to specific questions of what they're going to look at in the evaluation, that is bringing them involved in evaluative thinking. So keep in mind, the difference here is that in many evaluations, traditional evaluations, the evaluator is in charge and makes those decisions, or in evaluations that are commissioned by someone who wants to hire evaluators, and they've already predetermined the evaluation design, the evaluation questions, the evaluation methods. There is no engagement with intended users, so there's no opportunity to learn. Utilization-focused evaluation, because of the engagement with intended users, is involving them in those decisions, in setting priorities and determining questions, and they're learning about that process. That's why it's called process use. They're learning about how to think evaluatively, what the process of evaluation is, not the program process, but the evaluation process. And that's where the term process use comes from.
The next thing to consider is reviewing alternative process use options. So in the book, we offer 10 different potential areas to focus on when you think about this idea of process use. We've talked about a few of these already, but one is this idea of infusing evaluative thinking into the organizational culture. So some of the ways that looks like is incorporating evaluative questioning into routine decision making. So, as decisions are made, what kinds of questions are you asking? When the commitment to ongoing capacity development and training and evaluation. One of the organizations I worked with for a long time has really built evaluation into their onboarding process, because we've been really working to build the capacity and have everyone see themselves as contributing to evaluation across the organization. So it's now part of their onboarding process. I developed some sort of training materials that can be used to at least get people all thinking about, particularly because they're using developmental evaluation, what is that and how is that different from what they may have done in the past? This gets back to, the second one gets back to the question about evaluation priorities, but this idea of shared understandings as an organization, setting those priorities and developing questions can produce more coherence about what the program model even is and what people are even working towards, as well as this idea of shifting organizational culture by giving different people a voice and hearing different perspectives. And then learning to learn is another. So this process of deciding the questions and methods and interpreting data involve this idea of learning to learn, and really thinking about how we learn and what we use to make decisions. And so facilitated group process to design evaluation involves learning as a group and starting to build that culture of learning. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, you covered it well.
Okay. So there's a fuller chart in the book, but that's just a few examples. The next one is exploring how process use and findings uses may be interconnected, interactive, and mutually interdependent. So it's helpful to really have examples and illustrate kind of how the connection between findings use and process use happen. We give an example in the book, I think, about exercise, right? Michael, do you want to give an example of the connection between process use and findings use that you found helpful?
I think a big part of this is that the more people are involved in all aspects of the evaluation, the more they are going to value the findings, understand the findings, and be able to think about what the findings mean. Interpreting data and acting on data is not natural. It's not automatic. And so as people are thinking about what are the priority questions they're going to ask, and what would be good evidence, and we take them through simulations about, before gathering data, about what would you do if the results came out this way, and what would you do if the results came out this other way. All of that is learning to think evaluatively, so that when the findings do emerge, people are ready to act on them. It's setting up expectation of use and building the capacity for use, so that where findings are simply dropped on people by an evaluator and they haven't been involved in things all the way along, they end up having to ask a lot of methods questions. They may disagree with the findings and therefore attack the methods because they haven't understood why those choices were made. So process use, we found, really sets the stage for high-level findings use.
Next is generate and share your own examples of process use to help intended users understand what it is and how it can be valuable. So we've already sort of talked about some of these examples, but really kind of helping people understand and seeing, in your own work, kind of seeing ways that you can share how being involved in the evaluation can really enhance both the organizational culture, individuals, staff development, and program outcomes. So it's just good. And this is contributes to this idea of intentionality, so that you're not just like hoping it gets in there and it's kind of like subtle thing, but that you're actually calling attention to this as an intentional part of the work that you're doing. And then finally, establish process use priorities. So as we said, there are a lot of different ways that process use can come out, and some may happen, without being specifically attended to. But if we think intentionally about this, again, kind of looking at some of these ones that we already talked about, the priority of infusing evaluative thinking into the organizational culture, if that is something that an organization wants to be able to do, you can think about the benefit of that, helping the evaluation become part of the way they're doing business, enhancing organizational effectiveness, helping people develop this shared language. And then really being clear about some of the challenges to that it requires this leadership involvement, ongoing training. It's not just going to happen once and stick. And that actually really changing culture isn't easy, and it can increase some conflict if there are people who are on board and not on board. And so just being aware of and in tune to some of those challenges, in addition to the benefits, as you're talking with how to design an evaluation to enhance process use, is helpful. Again, this idea of shared understanding, the benefits are getting people on the same page, supporting alignment of resources and priorities, but it can also, force premature closure before different alternatives are considered. So, making sure that you're involving enough people that shared understanding is really authentic and isn't just, a couple of key people who are really interested. And again, it's a power dynamic. So that becomes really important as you're thinking about intended users and who's involved, making sure that you're enhancing shared understanding across different positions and perspectives, rather than just, those who are always in charge of the decision makers. And then this idea of learning to learn. Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll give an
Okay, so I'll just do
example
the
to it,
last one. Okay, great. So this capacity building piece, the long-term contribution, this is a skill that can be valuable beyond just a specific program, and really enhances adaptability, which is so important, as we've been hearing so much lately, and is what we're going to talk about next, this idea of adaptation. But there, in this context, the evaluator serves multiple purposes, and it can be a challenge, especially if you've got someone doing internal evaluation, potentially confusing the evaluation role. So really helping to think about the different roles that people are playing within the evaluation, and helping to clarify that. I think there's a real benefit to this idea as an organization that everyone's an evaluator, but then also that can water it down if there's no one person sort of leading the charge. So making sure that that's clear, that there's a role for everyone, and there are certain people who are kind of moving things forward intentionally. And that, we have kind of pushed back on this idea of the evaluator being independent, but there can be some challenges, especially from funders and different stakeholders, if the evaluator is seen as not independent enough. So making that clear what the evaluator role is and how they're embedding in the organization is really important, that transparency piece, and having that that decision to do that be explained and clear to those who need to know.
Part of what we mean by being intentional about process use and the kind of decisions that get made, especially is affected by who is involved and how many people are involved, because the people who are involved are going to get a lot more out of it. I was asked by the Blandon Foundation, a foundation serving rural Minnesota, to take their senior staff through a process of examining successful grants and unsuccessful grants so that they could learn to be better grant makers. But the process use effect of that was to really solidify the team. The team became tighter and began looking at not just what was effective in their work with grantees, but they turned that into looking at what was effective in their work with each other. And they developed a principle that they didn't know something until they knew it together. And it changed how they did staff meetings. And it was such a powerful process that they decided to take the reflective practice process to their board and have their board go through it. And then they took the entire organizational staff through a process of reflective practice, because they wanted everybody to benefit from not just hearing the findings of what were effective grants and non-effective grants, but to go through the reflective process of learning how to think about that. And they decided to make it a total organizational activity in order to embed evaluative thinking in the organization and the board. That's an example of choosing how to engage in process use.
And I will say we've been talking mostly about benefits, but I think one of the dangers or downsides of it is when you do intentionally engage stakeholders in an evaluation process and really, want to hear their voice. But then don't do anything with that information or don't follow up, that can actually have a negative impact on their willingness or interest in participating in evaluation in the future. You know, we often do an exercise at the beginning of what's your, what do you think of when you hear the word evaluation, and welcoming all perspectives, and get a lot of negative words. People have had bad experiences with evaluation. And so being attentive to the negative impacts of an evaluation on people, as well as potential positive, is really important to take care.
So it does take facilitation skill, and you're getting, the more people you get involved, the more likely you are to get the naysayers, the people who need a lot of attention, the people who are not getting it, and so it increases the need for evaluators to have high capacity.
Mm-hmm. One of the examples we have about process use is, we've talked in other webinars, I believe, about the food system summit that we worked on with Blue Marble evaluation, and we synthesized reports from over 800 independent dialogues that were convened around the world by small organizations, independent groups around transforming the food system. And what we did, in addition to reading the reports, is we identified 4 important groups to kind of dig in deeper: women, smallholder farmers, indigenous peoples, and youth, to really elevate their voices. They're traditionally marginalized. And so we invited the conveners of those dialogues that were focused on any of those 4 groups to participate in a focus group where they met one another. And we reflected on the themes that we had heard come out of their report, and got their feedback on whether those felt accurate, whether we were missing anything. And really the outcome of that, in addition to helping us really have a better, clearer picture of what the important themes were that those participants then felt connected. And there were a lot of calls for further opportunities to connect with one another, which was not the intention necessarily, but we did want to have people talk with one another, because you can, really gather a bigger picture of what some of the common themes are. But this idea that they felt less isolated and more connected to one another was an example of process use.
And in the bigger picture of things, the purpose of these dialogues, there ended up being over 1,000 of them. Anybody could convene a dialogue on any aspect of food and agriculture systems, while their intent was to feed opinions and knowledge and experiences into the United Nations Food System Summit itself. The process of being involved in the dialogues was so powerful that the dialogues, as a method of engaging people globally, was a major outcome of the process. And so not just the content of the dialogue, which was the original focus, but how dialogues are a way for the global community to connect with each other, to connect with people, to understand these issues collectively. That process of engagement methodologically has emerged as quite important. And I'm doing some writing with David Navarro, who convened the country dialogues, about dialogues as a policy process, as an engagement process, as a thinking process.
So we're going to wrap up process use here. Wanted to just show, we already talked about empowerment evaluation, but a lot of these different types of evaluation, participatory, collaborative, transformative, really have process use embedded in the way that that evaluation is done, and really that the participants play a meaningful role in the evaluation process. Their voices are honored, valued, and respected, and that engagement deepens their capacity to think evaluatively and to use findings ultimately. So, and yes, developmental evaluation as well. Thanks, Lori. There's a few challenges to process use: misuse potential, staying focused, not going off too far from the evaluation process, and transparency about potential controversies, the way that evaluation is defined, goals, confusion, like that, as goals of an organization are being developed, making sure that there's clarity there and role confusion, as I already talked about. There's also some that idea of this internal external evaluation. So different things to just stay aware of. Do you want to add anything to the challenges? I know we're kind of getting tight on time, but anything you've seen that is challenging to process use? Okay.
Well,
We have-
anything that's a challenge in evaluation can become a challenge in process use. It's mainly a people issue. So whatever kind of people issues there are, they'll show up with process use.
And if you've read any of the UFP texts, you'll know there's some good cartoons in there. Do you want to explain this one?
Well, this is the story of it's a Sufi tale where the wise fool Nasruddin has been getting visibly rich by smuggling something, but the border guards can never catch him at what he's smuggling with. When his donkeys cross the border with him, they search the saddlebags, they search him, they can never find what he's smuggling. So one of the guards is retired, and at a bar one night when Nasruddin comes in and he says, "Look, let me buy you a couple beers. I promise not to tell anybody, but it's bugged me all these years to figure out how you were smuggling and we could never catch you. What were you smuggling?" And Nasruddin said, "Donkeys." So the point of this cartoon is, you see at the bottom there, do you have anything to declare? And he says, yes, evaluation is a way of thinking. And the donkey says they're only looking for findings. So this was the oblivion I described to you for the first 20 years of my career, where we were only focusing on findings. We didn't see the process use. It was right in front of us. It was like smuggling donkeys right in front of your eyes. But once we saw it everywhere.
So I invite you to put questions in the chat. What we're going to do is move on to the principle 8, but we will take time at the end to answer questions about both principles, and we will probably stay after 11 o'clock our time, after the top of the hour, to answer questions if folks have them, or if you want to stick around, because we know we're kind of squishing content in today. So go ahead and put them in the chat, but we'll answer them at the end at this point. Unless they directly connect to what we're talking about next, which is USP operating principle 8, adapt, which calls us to watch for, be alert to, and adapt to change circumstances, shifting priorities, turnover among intended users, reallocation of resources, change timelines, and other factors that emerge over time. Avoid blinders and rigidity. So some of the premises here in this piece are: adaptive management requires adaptive evaluation. Adaptability is essential to dealing with the turbulence, uncertainties, and dynamics of complex systems. Adapt or die applies to evaluation as much as to the evolution of species. And adaptation is a mindset, not a procedure. I'll let you take this one, this paradigm shift of adaptation.
The pandemic has really made us much more aware of this, as has the ascendance of developmental evaluation and more attention to complexity. But evaluation has been dominated, as has planning and management for the last 50 years, on a paradigm of plan your work and work your plan, which suggests that we're in control, that accountability is based on planning your work and working your plan. But in a rapidly changing world where context varies, where you have crises, what's now being called the polycrisis, the pandemic, there's the crises of the climate emergency, misinformation, disinformation, changing economics, inflation, the politics that are going on, like the election in the US last week and in Brazil the week before. All of these contextual changes affect how evaluation is done, how it's commissioned. And so learning that way becomes important. And there are a number of ways of doing it. Iona asked about agile methodologies, and that would be appropriate. The very notion of of being agile, of being adaptive, of being open and shifting. This is especially true in innovative programs, programs that are trying out new models or are trying to adapt to changing the target populations. As the target populations change, as social media changes, as means of communication change, the evaluation ends up having to change. And keep in mind that many evaluation contracts are typically 3 years or 5 years in length. That's a long time in today's world. A lot can change in a 3-year to 5-year timeline. 3 years from now, there will have been another presidential election in the United States. And the ways in which contracts unfold, plan your work, work your plan, is a accountability kind of evaluation where you're held accountable to do what's in a contract, and the contracts are often rigid. So we negotiate from the very beginning that we expect to adapt, that we expect there to be contingency money, that all the money is not allocated to predetermined methods so that there's no money to bring in new methods and new approaches. And that, as Charmaine said, is a mindset much more than it is a particular approach.
And it really gets to this idea of evaluation management as a competency, which effective evaluation management is embedded into many, if not most, of the evaluation competencies called some, domain planning and management, management practice, management skills, project management. And in a recent chapter I wrote with Keiko Kuji-Shakatani and Wendy Rowe, we talked about particularly this idea of evaluation management, but moving into evaluation leadership and what that means to actually when potentially that program management isn't being adaptive, the need to lead the adaptation from the evaluator position to really push forward some of the evaluation priorities as being adaptive, because you won't necessarily always get it from your client. Sometimes you need to be sort of in an evaluation leadership capacity and actually drive that forward. So we already talked about COVID-19 in many ways sort of has shifted the paradigm globally to the importance of adaptation. And if you haven't already read, it's a couple years old now, this blog, but this is a blog that Michael wrote about the evaluation implications of the coronavirus. Really, the importance of being responsive has never been more clear. But particularly, I think the last point he makes around the preparing to make the case for evaluation's value as financial challenges arise and program budgets are being cut, helping commissioners and program managers see the value of evaluation in this adaptive reality is really going to be more and more critical. Do you want to add anything to that?
A good example of this recent experience with developmental evaluation, the World Food Program commissioned a retrospective developmental evaluation of their response to COVID. And I coached the group that was doing the contract. The World Food Program at any one time has thousands of people on short-term contracts in refugee camps, in places where there are natural disasters or civil disasters, humanitarian disasters. People go out for a month, 2 months, under WFP contracts to help provide food, to help support getting people stabilized. And when COVID hit and began imposing quarantines, there were thousands of WFP part-time employees who were suddenly quarantined where they couldn't go back to their families or friends or loved ones for sometimes as much as 6 months to 9 months. And when the evaluation team began interviewing those people to gather data about how WFP had supported them and what kind of response the World Food Program had had in dealing with this challenge of the staff, they found that the people they were interviewed, the people who had suddenly been quarantined and were stuck someplace for months, that they had been so traumatized and the interviews were so emotional that they had to stop the interview process and have all of their evaluation interview staff go through trauma-informed training, learning how to do interviewing with people whose lives have been turned upside down, who've experienced trauma, who are very emotional, and in many cases are the first opportunities to tell their story and to ask for help, how to manage those boundaries. So that's an example of having to adapt. They started out thinking, oh, we're just doing routine interviews with people in the field about their experiences. And they had to stop and get trauma-informed interview a skill, adaptation, in order to complete the interviewing.
Yeah. I'm sure many of you have other examples of this, and you know, in many ways, I think that it's just the beginning of the adaptation, you know, as climate change. We talk about COVID as sort of the dry run for climate change, and this is not going away. So continuing to think about adaptation in the context of where we're at in the world is it's gonna continue to be important. We already talked about this idea of adaptation of a mindset. One of the things that can help create or nurture this mindset is this idea of risk assessment and sort of risk assessment to the evaluation. So the idea risk. So this idea of to what extent does the program, logic model, or theory of change work in practice? Idea risk increases when new, untested, and innovative ideas are being tried out. So particularly in new contexts and as things are changing, like, is the program model still relevant? What are we learning about that? Implementation risk, to what extent is implementation of the program idea actually occurring? And this increases when new organizations or inexperienced staff are implementing a program where the environment is turbulent. And that, you know, goes to what Michael said in terms of the ability to interview people in really difficult situations, or the ability to gather data or do a survey when, you know, the situation is really turbulent. It just, you have to really keep that in mind. And then evidence risk, to what extent do evaluation findings allow distinguishing idea success or failure from implementation success or failure? Evidence risk increases when data will be hard to collect or access to needed data is problematic. And, you know, we've also seen that particularly with the rise of this sort of post-truth era, evidence risk is even greater when the evidence that you do have is called into question, and this threat to science and data generally. And so how do you account for that? How do you address that? Anything else you want to say around that, Michael?
No, it's adaptation is not just a professional mindset, it's increasingly a personal mindset as well in our lives. And so the combination of those things, folks who are rigid are going to have a tough time, whatever they're doing.
Yeah. So this is where the agile, I told you it was coming. This is from the book, Exhibit 13. This is all from chapter 13. Connects the agile business, agility concepts to utilization-focused evaluation adaptations. So we talk about the law of the small team, the law of the customer, the law of the network, and organizational culture. Do you want to summarize any of these points, Michael, or just, I don't want to read through every single thing, but anything you want to call attention to here?
I think we've returned to organizational culture, that it's not just a matter of individuals being adaptive. Many evaluations take place in a team. The team has to be adaptive. The program has to be adaptive. The community has to be adaptive. And so there are layers of adaptability that are interconnected here. And Sabina mentioned foresight techniques. There are increasingly ways of planning and preparing and building the capacity to be adaptive through foresight scenarios, where, like, firefighters practice putting out fires, and actors and actresses practice doing plays, and improv theater and jazz players practice improvisation. Evaluators need to be able to practice changing. And that's one of the things that a session like AEA could do instead of lecturing, is have scenario practice sessions where we get to do some of that. And sometimes the think tanks at AEA do it.
Really. Here's another cartoon for you. Plan Q. And this is, Michael, you've already talked about this, but the idea of adaptive contracting, contingency budgeting, building this organizational and societal culture supportive of evaluation use. I don't think we need to go into too much more detail around that. But there's another exhibit in the book around this idea of, oh, do you want the cartoon again? I'll pull the cartoon up in one sec. This idea of sort of comparing traditional fixed evaluation design with UFE adaptability. So evaluation purpose is driven by use, and that may shift as, you know, the utility may change. If you're no longer doing the same program, you're not going to want to be doing the same evaluation. The questions are likely to change. The methods are likely to change, particularly if you can't implement a certain method due to changing conditions. Timelines for reporting, you know, we can get really rigid around reporting and making that more flexible, and even the types of reporting that you're doing more interim memos or other types of ways to get people real-time information when, rather than waiting until the very end, is going to be really important. And this idea of accountability for learning and adaptation is really important, rather than just, did you do what you said you were going to do? So those are some things to keep in mind. I'm going to put the cartoon back up for Iona, and then do you want to talk a little bit more about contracting for Lori, Michael, and what that looks like?
The difficulty here in some ways is almost personality and organizational culture intersecting around rigidity. And I feel strongly about it. It's almost like a trigger for me, because when I ran a project in the Caribbean for 10 years for USAID, and that's a long time, and a lot happened. And we had a USAID team come through, internal USAID team come through to from an accountability perspective, and we had changed a lot of what we had done, and they were ultimate bean counters. They simply looked at what the scope of work was, what the original plan was, what we had did, and anything that had been changed, they wanted paperwork evidence of, they wanted approval of, and they weren't prepared to think at all. I mean, during the 10 years that I was there, Grenada had the invasion. There were 2 hurricanes that majorly affected islands. Britain stopped their banana subsidies, which changed the economy of agriculture completely. There were political coups and turnovers. There was a major volcano eruption in Montserrat. All of these things had phenomenally changed agriculture, and we adapted to them. And these accountants come through and want to know where the paper trail is, and who approved the changes that we had made. So there's a mindset here about rigidity and accountability that goes up against this work. And so when we do contracts, we build in contingency language, and the expectations there'll be change and mechanisms to do small scale adapting without having to go back and get approvals. But it's important to know what the approval processes are. We went through lots of hassles because we hadn't done the paperwork in advance, both programmatically and evaluatively. And so figure out what has to be done to make changes, try to minimize that, and build authority into the evaluation team and the advisory group, the stakeholder group, to make those changes on a common sense basis.
And sometimes I also do like phased contracts where instead of it being, you know, a full 3-year contract at the beginning, it's, you know, for 6 months and then you do another one. And I think sometimes that, particularly if you've got a large organization that you're trying to, you know, make sure that there's salary there, that can be tricky to do. But for us, because we're small small, nimble group, we can kind of do that where we aren't needing the 3-year commitment right up front, and we can kind of phase that in so that we make sure that it's a good fit and that we can adapt after we learn a little bit for that first period, what needs to happen next.
Another contracting lesson I learned was I was once had an evaluation contract that was part of a major several $100 million contract for the greater metropolitan area, that it had 37 agencies involved and 300 lawyers signed off on. And it was so highly specific that it made it almost impossible to change anything. And fortunately, when I saw what was coming, I went to them and got our part of the contract removed from that master contract so that we didn't have to go through the entire Metropolitan Council to make a change in one small part of this subcontract, but that we got an entire separate process that gave us more flexibility. And so you want to think about how, whatever your contracting is, think about making some change, even run a scenario ahead of time. What if we had to do this? What would be the process, so that you know what the conditions are and can try to anticipate it? And yes, hang on to the paperwork. We actually didn't even do, I mean, we were mainly having meetings and making decisions, and sometimes they were in the minutes, but it was the Caribbean. We weren't, we weren't highly structured. We were getting together, talking about things and deciding to do things differently. So we hadn't really done a good job on the paper trail, and that came back to bite us. One of my mentors, Vito Perrone, who ran a very innovative program in North Dakota at the University of North Dakota, and got away with all kinds of stuff. And I once asked Vito, how are you able to do such innovative and outside the box things in the university? And he said, Michael, I always get the paperwork done. You have to feed the monster. You do the paperwork and you can do anything else you want to.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that, that requirement of paper trails and transparency comes from a good place of trying to avoid corruption and people doing things, that they shouldn't be doing. And it has led to that culture of rigidity. So it's one of those things, maybe unanticipated consequences. And yeah, finding workarounds and making sure there's transparency and accountability in the innovation and adaptation is really important. We've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to pull up a slide that you probably know. Michael's been active on YouTube. He said he'll put out a video later today about the conference that we just came from. But we invite you to, if you haven't already, subscribe to his YouTube page. We will be back together for our final webinar of 2022 on December 14th. We'll be doing the final 2 principles, principle 9 and 10 of UFE. And then we're still thinking about what's going to come in the next year, 2023. We'll continue to do gatherings, webinars, maybe more of a community of practice style, reconnect with Blue Marble evaluation. So we are kind of trying to revive Blue Marble in the coming year. We've been so focused on UFE as the umbrella for Blue Marble, but I'm really hoping to reconnect with the Blue Marble network and create more of a community of practice style meetings or gatherings where we're sharing lessons and maybe doing some coached consulting of organizations or projects trying to do Blue Marble evaluation. So all of that is to come, and I want to thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again next month. Wishing you all the best.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks.